Go to the very first shop, hands up. Yeah, some early customers here. They then later moved, of course, to Harbison Road in Balham. But as well as parts, the social side also developed around those trades as well. So please welcome to the stage a selection of our trades. Steve Hall, unfortunately, from TR Enterprises, just had to dash off. He's got a very long way to drive. Got to go all the way back to Oban in Scotland. So we say cheerio to Steve. But please welcome to the stage Neil Revington, Gary Bates, Pete Cox and Pete Buckles. And if we have anyone else from the trade that I haven't mentioned who fancies telling their story, do come and join us. It's an open panel session today. I know Simon Hebditch from Rob Sport was here last night. If he's still here, we'll have him up as well. But gentlemen, take your seats and we'll have a chat about how the trade began. But we'll start with, of course, the Cox and Buckles story, and Pete Buckles arriving at the stage here. And Graham will come and join us on stage as well. We'll start with you, Mr. Buckles. Tell us then about those early days pulling together spares within the TR register. How did it all begin, and how did it lead to Cox and Buckles?
Well, I started life, all this talk of expensive and cheap TRs. I owned 14 TR2s, 3s and 3As, and one of them that I bought from Dave Whistler cost me £120, and all the rest cost me less than £100. And I bought a car with no engine and gearbox, and the guy who sold it to me said, round Belsize Park somewhere, there's a car that's got damage on every panel. And you wouldn't think that the petrol deck, where the filler cap is, would have a dent on it. It did. Every door had a dent on it. Every wing had a dent on it. The front apron, it looked like it hit a tree. And we drove round trying to find this car, KJB 595 it was, and we found it. I put a note on it. The guy actually drove it to my house. It had an MOT. I paid 30 quid for it, and I paid 30 quid for the one that had a good body without an engine. I put the two together, and it had cost me 60 quid, and I'd got, you know, a spare door with a dent in it and some boot hinges and a steering idler and all that. So I put an advert in the Exchange and Mart for about 6 and 8 pence. And by Saturday lunchtime, I'd recouped 72 quid. So I'd got a free car and 12 quid's worth of profit, less the money on the advert for the Exchange and Mart. So I thought, this is a good game. I then had a major stroke of luck. There's a little paper shop in Mornington Crescent, and you could see, and it was like, in those days, there was no drugs problems, but it was like a current drug dealer's den. There's people walking around looking up. How do you know? Because I was in Hanworth, and they've got drug dealers there, plenty of them. And about 5:15, on Wednesday evening, Thursday's Exchange and Mart was put in the front window, a big pile like this. And by 5:25, there weren't any. And I bought a car from a guy called Ken Westgarth, who lived on the A45. And he'd run into a tree, but his mum worked at the factory, so it got a brand new 4A head, brand new 4A gearbox, brand new 4A overdrive, and a whole load of new other stuff. I bought that for 90 quid, and by that Sunday, I'd got about 180 quid. So I'd realised that this was a good game. But the problem with selling second-hand parts is that if a steering idler wears out, it wears out on every car. And you really have to make the stuff new. Although the first problem we had was body panels. We met here in 1970 twice, and TR3 quarter panels were not available. They'd been discontinued. And they're almost the first bit of the car that rusts. So I looked around, and in 1977 I found a panel making company whose two other major car spares customers were Rolls-Royce and Aston Martin. But they are the kind of people that in our business, in the aftermarket, you have to find. Because if you find someone who makes something for Ford, they want to make 500 a day or possibly an hour. And we probably don't sell 500 of anything a year. So they are not the kind of people you want. Whereas the panel place in Reading made the Corniche panels, and they used to make one a day, if they were lucky. And so low volume, high quality work is what we needed. And we did...
About the early wings.
Yeah, well, the early wings, but the early floors and quarter panels were okay, boot liners and all that kind of thing. And I was based in the southeast, but Pete, based in the Midlands, yeah, car spares are cheap in the Midlands because everybody knows someone who works for a company that makes car spares. And so, you know, his mate phones someone up and you've got a pair of shock absorbers for £1, 2 and 6 when they should have been £4. And in fact, you know, there's on the back of that post there, I think there's a list of prices. I couldn't get £11 for an overdrive. I'd advertised it and no one wanted it. So if I advertised it now for £11, I'd probably be able to sell car parking spaces for the people turning up to buy it. But and then I met Pete, and Pete had a source of Triumph factory clearance parts, a guy called Huey Hill, who was a very nice guy, except he was an alcoholic. So he took me out for lunch, and I had a steak and chips, and he had yeah. He took me out. I had a steak and chips, and he had 7 scotches. And the drive home was interesting, I have to say. But we have developed, between Pete and I, we've developed probably 4,000 part numbers for the TR range. I mean, I started the shop in London on the 20th of February 1975, and in about October that year, I used to order. You used to get a stock order every 2 weeks, and I used to order 20 700 913, which is the rear overrider, and all of a sudden in October they delivered 4, and I said, no, I ordered 20. He said, no, they're no longer available. I said, look, I've just given up a good career to sell car parts, and you're telling me they're not available. That's no good. Phone the factory and tell them I'm going to buy 20 every fortnight for the next 2 or 3 years. He said, well, we did phone them to see if they were definitely no longer available, but they are. The tooling's gone. And in fact, the whole company that used to make them for Triumph was gone, and that was Wilmot Breeden. So I actually went to America, where someone was making them, believe it or not, in the sunshine. I went to see the press where they were pressed. It was out in a yard in Los Angeles. And I said, what do you do when it rains? He said, those 2 days we work inside.
And you have really good memories of those early customers as well. You can even recite some of their addresses, I believe.
Yeah, well, my first shop, I started working at home in 11 Crossways Road. And then I opened a shop, and the guy walked in, and he said, oh, could you get me this and this? And Pete Cox had to get some of the bits for me. And I said, so where do I send them to? He said, oh, my name's Richard Poor, and my address is 51 Old London Road, Brighton. I said, that's easy. I'm 51 London Road, Tooting. So, and Richard Poor, I think, still around. He's still, I don't think he's got a 3A anymore.
Is it the back?
So there he is. Are you still at 51 London Road, Brighton? Old London? Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, sensible. I moved from London, so let's get the balance right.
So, of course, the man who knows probably more than anyone about building TR gearboxes is the man to your right there, Pete Cox. Tell us about your story into TRs, Pete, how it all began.
Well, it was probably started by the fact that my wife worked for the RAC, and she said, I don't know whether you're interested, but there's this club just started in 1970. He said, and they're going to hold a meeting, and you've missed the first one, so get along to the second one. And it was as easy as that for me. I was happily working at very clean environment in a laboratory, hating every day. And they rather stupidly agreed to put together a workshop so that I could make these gadgets for use in, well, you'd call it vivisection these days, wouldn't you? Nasty things to bolt onto rats and mice and rabbits and cats and dogs. And I developed certain, I wouldn't call them skills, but I did repair a gearbox for somebody back in 1968, and I'll just say he had change out of a £1 note in those days. You wouldn't get that now. You may ask, but you won't get it. And it all went very well until the doom and gloom news arrived that the department was closing, and would I like to look for a job somewhere else? And you've got a month's notice. And that was when my contacts with Pete here, I'd known him well for 3 years by then, turned into a career. But back in 1970, late in 1970, I used to go to a Triumph dealer in Birmingham. I don't know whether it's still there now, because it was PJ Evans, but I think it's Evans Halshaw now. And it was run by a man called Cecil Studholme, who was no stranger to the top shelf in the bar, you know. And he, when I used to buy the usual spares for my TR in there, and he said, why don't you meet me for a meal, and we'll go out and we'll talk about setting you up an account. And that was when I met John Davey as well. Now, I'd never seen a man go into early stages of heart attack, but John Davey said to Cecil, he said, we think you should give Mr. Cox, I'd never even been taken out for a meal in my life at that time, we think we should give him some discount. And anyway, it went from there. So, but they got me an introduction to Bean Industries, who were closing down. All their, they must have done a lot of unit repairs for Triumph, and we were sold as a car club, although the car club hadn't got any money, so it was our money, a very small load of spares. Well, this turned into quite a sort of a run of things that were going to happen in the future, and two that stand out most were in 76, we were invited to go and empty the old production line at Speak so that they could move TR7 fully into there. And we agreed a price on 1,500 quid for designated spares. And when we got there with our empty 7.5 tonner, there was a warehouse to clear. And Pete and I went together. Pete was left expired at my house in Birmingham after we'd emptied the first truckload. And I did 6 more trips after that, all for 1,500 quid. And how long did it take you to sell those Speedo cables?
Oh, only about 15 years.
Yeah, there you go. And the other one, now you might notice there's a slight imbalance in size of Pete and I. Now, Pete had a lot more up top in those days, and because he used to do weight training, and we were told by the same source. Oh, incidentally, the currency in Birmingham in the early 70s was SU carburettors, just in case you were wondering, you know. But well, that's a different thing. But we were offered some TR6 cylinder blocks. I can't remember the place, but it must have been near Whitney, somewhere in the Oxford area anyway. And again, it was 100 of them, and I told Pete, he said, oh yeah, we'll have to have those. You better get them. Anyway, I hired a 7.5 tonner again, and they put 80 on this truck, and it collapsed onto its tyres. I think you better stop there. Now, I drove him back to the shop in Fairfax Road, which was an ordinary. It was a shoe shop before I had it, so you can tell the size of it. And I said to people, "What am I going to do with these?" He said, "Well, unload them and take the truck back. We're not paying another day's rent on it." And how many of you ever picked up a 6-cylinder engine, single-handed? Well, there are 82 of them on the truck. And I had to unload them single-handed round the back of the shop while I was serving customers. And I developed a few muscles at that point. But anyway, that was the sort of forerunner of the sort of thing that happened. We did get other offers, but that was the most painful one of them. And while all this was going on, of course, we were building, me and 2 other chaps in the shop were building 5 gearboxes a day, every day, 6 days a week, and selling them all. So that on Saturday afternoon when we closed, the yard out the back was full of oily, rusty, dirty scrap, and all the stock had gone. But it went on like that for many years, and it carried on, well, to this day. Yeah.
Well, of course, your enthusiasm for TRs outside of running Cox and Buckles was always strong, and in the very year that Cox and Buckles sponsored the TR Register Race Championship, 86 I think it was, you came along as a sponsor and also won the championship that year as well.
Well, you're close. We started in 84, and several of us have pictures of the inaugural, or the pre-championship meeting, which was held at Studley, wasn't it? Yeah. And I think Reg Woodcock provided a car. Somebody, there was a Healy 3000 there, DD 300, and there were 2 interesting cars. And that was when Val Simpson was there as well, and that was where it was talked about. But the championship started in '84, and I turned up at the first race with my aluminium car, expecting to wipe the floor with this thing, you know, because I'd never driven anything as fast in my life. And we all did our first session of practice, and I was driving up towards the corner before the pits, which is Lodge, and changing into third to slow down, and I did that. The guy who actually won the championship that year, Dennis Welch, drove past me changing into top in his Healy. And but 4 races later, I drove past him, and I never saw him again. My car was faster than his by then. But I actually won the championship in '86. The famous Mr. Woodcock showed us all what to do in 1985, and he would have probably done it in '86, but he made a silly mistake at Alton Park, and he was following a chap called Mike Walker, who is also famous for 1 or 2 interesting crashes, who'd got some demon wet weather tyres on, and he went off on a corner and did too much damage to the car, and that was it. He never raced again in a championship. But he is still alive, in case anybody wants to know. His brother Dave died years ago. His brother Ray, unfortunately, has terminal cancer, and between them they have about 15 cars, and Reg has at least 6 bikes. And he goes to visit his mother. Reg is now 80. He goes to visit his mother in the old folks' home, who's 104, every day. And so if you want to get hold of him, don't bother to ring him in the afternoon. But yes, it was a good, and I carried on racing until 1995, and I moved house, and I didn't really do it in my own car again. So, but I've raced. I had a lot of fun racing other people's cars, giving them the bills.
And still rebuilding gearboxes today, Pete, as well?
About 5 a week.
Oh, so you're retired then?
I'm fully retired now, yeah.
Well, of course, lots of businesses sort of stemmed out of the TR Register in its early days and out of Cox and Buckles, and you were linked in a certain way because in those days there was a distribution network, if you like, of other businesses that were helping move parts around the country, and that was sort of where you come into this story, isn't it, Neil?
Yeah, it is, and Pete hasn't alluded to it yet, but we had a little network which Pete set up, which included myself, Just Mansfield, who's at the back there, and Darryl of Restorations, and Bob Soden. And that was it, I think, wasn't it? So the way that, well, let's go back a bit first, having set that as something that opened up a bit of a network, and have to bear in mind we're talking 1977 or so. So there was no internet or anything of that nature to make life easy as it is today. So my life started as an apprentice in the aircraft industry, along with Dick Roberts, who's here. We started our apprenticeship on the same day. And the fact that that was a quality assurance apprenticeship has always, if you like, marked the way I deal with things, in that quality is the most important, where you can achieve it, and that's got to be not confused with excellence. Quality and excellence are two completely different things, but quality is important for sure. So after I'd finished my apprenticeship, I was working in West London, and Pete and I, i.e. Pete Buckles and I, would meet at the windmill on Clapham Common. From time to time, Lucas Lukey of TR Shop would sometimes come along and try and sell us something that nobody wanted. And there were various old lags that used to come along to that pub. Just as an aside, incidentally, I was on Clapham Common a few months ago watching Madness, and we had to go into the windmill and go and have a beer. Didn't look anything like I remember it, but then it was 40 years ago, or whatever. So we'd go up to the windmill for the meetings, the TR register meeting for the London group, and I used to go out with a mutual friend of Dick and mine called Mac, who I roomed with. When I was an apprentice, I lived in a YMCA hostel for 6 years, and Mac and I would go up to the TR meetings. And drink way too much winter warmer if it was the winter. And I remember one particular occasion coming down the North Circular, it would be, or the Great Western Road, I think it's called. And I was looking down the road and I said to Mac, I can see 3 buses. How many can you see? And he said, I can see 2. And I said, well, I'm bloody sure there's only one, so you'd better drive. But in those early days, as Pete said, this would be 74, I suppose, 75, that kind of time, spares were really quite difficult. And Peter's just told us that he started the shop in 75. I'm guessing that's right. I'd have had it as earlier, but if you say 75, 75 it is.
I used to sell from my home.
Well, I know that because I used to turn up outside your house and Marcia would hang out the window and say, get off my lawn!
Yeah.
And there would be a whole raft of cars outside that were in some measure of disarray, where Pete was disassembling them and selling parts. So that was all about the time that I moved to Somerset. So I was moved by the Ministry of Defence, because the department I was working for was the Aeronautical Quality Assurance Directorate of the Procurement Executive of the Ministry of Defence. Sounds wonderful. Tedious, though, but nonetheless. So I was... Yeah, it does, yeah, the quality's gone by the time you've said it. So I was a quality assurance engineer down at Westland Helicopters, and it didn't really work out. I was invited to leave. You don't get sacked from the Ministry of Defence. I was invited to leave, which I duly did. And I can remember coming home and saying to Sue, by the way, we'd moved in 77, so this would be about 1980. And I started to do a bit of work for people's cars, because in 1977 we started the Apple County group of the TR Register. So people would come along and say, where can I get this done on my car? Well, bearing in mind I'd rebuilt TKR 49 in 1971, chassis off complete restoration, and it wasn't a big deal. I'd commandeered one of the sheds in the YMCA hostel and rebuilt the car there. And if Sue wanted to see me, she had to come and get her hands dirty and help restore the car with me. So when we were down in Somerset, it was quite easy for me to say to people, bring it round on Saturday and I'll fix it. And so in actual fact, we'd started to do a bit of work, and there was such a thing at the time as called the rebuild on a budget that Pete had started. And he phoned me up one day and he said, all this stuff that you're ordering, how many cars have you got? I'm just selling them to people around and about in Somerset. He said, we better have a chat about that then. So given that we'd started the Apple County group, and given that I'd just been invited to leave the MOD, and we'd got one rebuild that a gentleman had asked me to do on a TR4A, I came home to Sue, who was standing in the kitchen at the garden cottage, and I can see her standing there now. And I came up behind her and said, guess what? I'm not in work anymore, but on the way home I worked out that you can pay the mortgage. So we started, and we had the phone call with Pete about where all this stuff was going. And it was at that time that Pete invited me to come up with a trailer behind my TR2. And I reckon I had £5 grand in the bank, and you very kindly put up you matched it with another 5, and so we gave me 120 days to pay, which was most generous. And so we filled it up with stuff, most of which I'm pretty sure was stuff Pete couldn't sell. So it was an easy way to get rid of it. I'm being unfair.
Yeah, easy mistake.
Easy mistake to make, yeah. And so I filled up the little trailer, took it home, and started TR Spares Southwest, and that would be about 1980, something of that nature. And so since that, and at that time, a little bit later on, this little network was, I think it was probably your idea, Pete, to have a little bit of a sort of a network of people around the country who were ostensibly doing the same work as Cox and Buckles. So when I actually started, it was really to restore a car. I had no intention particularly of selling parts, but it became an obvious part of the business was that people would come to you if you were restoring cars to see whether you could supply certain parts. And so from then on, we've been manufacturing parts ourselves, and that actually came out again of what Pete has just described, in that Pete was doing the larger volume stuff, not necessarily the, do you want 500 a day, but nevertheless 500 would be a number, and you'd have to buy 500, and then Pete would have the network for being able to sell them. But that didn't help people like me who were trying to rebuild a car. It's all very well having 500 floors in stock, but if you actually haven't got a bulkhead and it's all rotten, then you need a bulkhead. So we set about getting the other bits that Pete wasn't making, because in his level of business it wasn't economically viable. So we went down the number chain to the even smaller numbers and made by hand, or had made by hand, some of the parts that you needed to make a complete car, to the point where we, particularly with the TR2 and 3A, we could actually make a complete body shell. And then that filtered through to other parts that weren't available that you needed to complete the restoration. So we've not made everything that you need to make the restoration. Obviously we pick not only from what was Cox and Buckles then, but other manufacturers who are in the TR world around and about. And I think what we've done is complemented what Cox and Buckles started by making the things that you need to complete a car, which wasn't necessarily economically viable at the Cox and Buckles level.
And of course, a lot of your parts you developed and learnt them from your involvement, and we'll talk a little bit more on the motorsport panel about the start of the Sprint Hill Climb Championship, because applying the lessons you'd learnt racing your TRs at quite a sort of grassroots level initially, and then applying that to what you thought other people would want to buy to get their cars to the same level.
And it isn't actually just all about racing. Think about reliability, maintainability, as well as performance. A lot of, not just myself, but other people have done things like a thin belt conversion on the TR2, 3 and 3A and 4 is not necessarily about a performance issue. It's about the fact that the fat belts that were available at the time were pretty rubbishy, and consequently it was, and particularly if you were in the middle of France and your belt went, then it's a lot easier to get a thin belt than it is to get a fat belt. So those sorts of modifications were about reliability and maintainability, and has been just as important as the performance side of things. So you're right, though, but with regard to competing in all sorts of motorsport, being able to produce parts that actually make them go quicker has been a significant part of the business. And typically, the suspension packages that we've developed are not my doing. I employed a suspension designer. There are much cleverer people than me that can design suspension. So we employed a guy called Chris Groves. Don't know whether he's still alive these days, but he had a very rudimentary computer modelling program in 1990. Which enabled him to model what would happen with a TR3. So I got in my TR2 and took it for a drive, and then got his tape measure out and started measuring things, put it all in the model, and came up with the dimensions that would give a satisfactory suspension package from one end to the other of the car. And then it was my job to engineer it onto the car and make something that was a saleable piece of kit and I've always tried with things that we've done to make it such that you don't ruin the car by cutting bits off or cutting holes in the bodywork to fit things. We try to make them bolt on and bolt off.
Except in the TR4 front wings.
Yeah, so those are the sorts of things we've tried to do. It's not just about performance, it's about maintainability and reliability.
Well, of course, the vision of the early days of the TR Register was not only to create a club and a group for people to come together and enjoy TRs together, but to ensure there was a parts supply and that the TR mark was preserved for the future. And thanks to the founders of the TR Register and then subsequently the people we have sat here, Pete Cox, Pete Buckles, Neil Revington, that was achieved. And TRs are still numerous and still on the road. So to this panel from the trade, please give them a big hand.